Welcome back to World History 24, where my older sister Ellie teaches me world history in order in just 24 hours. My name is Charlie. In our last episode, we covered the years 575 to 480 BCE. We heard the story of the Celts throughout Europe with their horses and barbaric pants. Ellie summarized 3 religious philosophical movements: Buddhism in India, Confucianism in China, and Zoroastrianism in Persia. We ended the episode and Season 1 with the breaking news that archaeologists using LiDAR technology had discovered hundreds of kilometers of interconnected roads, as well as the footprints of farm fields and buildings indicating a previously unknown major civilization in the rainforest of Ecuador. This episode will cover from 480 to 300 BCE. This includes the Second Temple period of Israel, a defining time for Judaism, when much of the Bible was written. As we travel southwest over Egypt and the Sahara, we find a major civilization in Nigeria known as the Nak, whose history is baked into terracotta. Then, spinning the globe, we arrive in the Woodland period in North America, where the Adena and Hopewell cultures are building intricate earthen mounds. Back in the Mediterranean Sea, a group of disparate warring city-states are hell-bent on conquering and enslaving one another. We now call them all simply Greece. And finally, the story of one famous Greek, who the Greeks seem to have hated, Alexander the Great. So without further ado, let's call Ellie and continue the magnificent story of human history. The year is 480 BCE. The clock is set to 480 BCE. Who are we going to start with today?
So we are going to start in Canaan, in the Kingdom of Judah, and we're going to talk about the Second Temple period and the writing of the Hebrew Bible.
Okay, cool.
So where did we leave the Israelites? If you remember, in our last episode, they were captive in Babylon when the Babylonian Empire falls to the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Mm-hmm. So Cyrus the Great of Persia frees the Israelites in 538 BCE, sends them home to Jerusalem.
Okay, right.
Or allows them to go home to Jerusalem, might be a better way to phrase that. They rebuild their temple. And so because the temple has been rebuilt, it's their second temple, and that gives this whole time period its name, which is the Second Temple period.
Gotcha. So if we're thinking in terms of Israelite history, we've gone from the Babylonian captivity period to the time period of this episode, which is the Second Temple period.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
And so the Second Temple period stretches roughly from 539 BCE to 73 CE. So, of course, at the beginning of this time period, it's under Persian rule, as we just said. The Persian Empire eventually falls to Alexander the Great, which we'll talk about at the end of this episode. And so at that point, the Kingdom of Judah is under the Greeks. Then it becomes part of the Ptolemaic Empire. Then it becomes part of the Seleucid Empire, and on and on. And so this is just, as we've said several times, this is like, unfortunately, the brutal reality of like this entire corner of Afro-Eurasia is just getting endlessly eaten by one expanding empire after another expanding empire. But of course, what that also means is that there's just endless cultural and intellectual and philosophical, like academic exchange amongst all these different peoples.
Right. It's not just that empires are taking over one after another. In addition, all the peoples of the empires and the elites and the warriors and the farmers and stuff are all talking to each other, exchanging stories and ideas and things.
Absolutely.
For the past 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Or thousands of years.
Thousands of years. Yeah, totally. And so it's during the Babylonian captivity, and certainly in the time period after, that the Judeans begin the cultural practices that we would recognize as Judaism today. they become increasingly and then entirely monotheistic. The God Yahweh moves from being, a statue in a temple in the center of a city to living in heaven and, being the one God. And it's important to note that these cultural practices are largely established amongst the elite in big cities. And this is true in, all over the world as major religions get established. It takes much, much longer for the average random farmer to be participating in the cultural practices of the sort of intellectual and political elites of a city.
As we distill history, it's easy to be left with the impression that once a religion begins, everyone in the surrounding regions more or less jumps on board right away. But the origins and the proliferation of a religion are two very different events, often separated by hundreds of years. Archaeology shows that generally people continue to practice their indigenous religions well after the urban elite have solidified into something new. In fact, this diversity of belief becomes an increasing theme in the writings and spirituality specifically of the Israelites, which eventually coalesce into one very influential set of books.
But of course, amongst the things that the intellectuals and the religious leaders, etc., are doing in Jerusalem is writing the Hebrew Bible.
Okay, so the religious practices have sort of been coalescing over this period of time, the Babylonian captivity, the Second Temple period, and simultaneously they're being codified.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so that brings us to the Hebrew Bible, which is an incredibly important book to world history, possibly the most important book ever written in world history. And so
Right.
I want to talk about it in a couple different ways. I want to start with just a question about vocabulary of sort of what do we mean when we say the Bible? So the phrase the Hebrew Bible is the academic term for a set of books, which in Judaism is called the Tanakh, and in Christianity is called the Old Testament. And so depending on exact branches of religious practice, the books contained within this set of books are different slightly, but in a rough sense, the Hebrew Bible is the academic term for these sets of books that are incredibly foundational to Judaism and Christianity. The first 5 books are called the Law or the Torah. And those are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you don't know anything at all about the Bible, but you just sort of hear things in the world, you might be like, I know there's the Garden of Eden and Noah's Ark and Joseph's amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat and the sea gets parted and there's a lot of thou shalt not do this and thou shalt not do that. All of that is in the first 5 books. And so those first 5 books are just, they couldn't be more, foundational. Those stories bring me to the second way that I want to talk about the Bible. And that is just what's in it. What is its content? What does it contain? So as is true when we talked about the Avesta, or when we talked about the Vedas, or other, religious texts, the Bible is filled with songs and prayers and philosophy and cosmology and proverbs and laws and lots of writing about how to live in right relationship with the divine, with your family, with your community at large, etc. Also in the Bible are many, many narrative stories. And these stories sort of run a broad spectrum from stories where people live to be 500 years old and there's dragons and retellings of stories like Gilgamesh and the flood, these stories that have been in these lands in the corner of Afro-Eurasia for a couple thousand years at this point, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where we have history that's unfolding, not much before it's being written down. So, a lot of that history is like names and dates that are corroborated by Persian history or Babylonian history or the Greeks or whoever, So
by archaeology, yeah.
Yeah. So it's a wide spectrum, and sort of the newer, the younger parts of the Bible are a little bit more rooted in history and the older parts of the Bible are, these old sort of mythologized stories, which again is so normal in religious texts.
Yeah, right.
And so because it's written over this long time period, there's many authors. And in some parts of the Bible, the authors change practically paragraph by paragraph. And then in other parts of the Bible, there's like almost an entire book written by one person, or there is an entire book written by one person, as far as we can tell. Mm-hmm. And so all of that makes it like a little hard to sift through. Like it's kind of sometimes hard to know, like when you're reading about an actual person and like this king who did this and did that, versus like suddenly somebody lives to be 1,000 or whatever.
Right.
The third way that I want to talk about the Bible just super quickly is just when it was written. Mm-hmm. And so the oldest parts of the Bible, like the oldest songs that are in the Bible are possibly as old as like 1,000 BCE. Mm-hmm. The Song of Deborah, the Song of the Sea. And scholars of ancient Hebrew say that they are to the Hebrew of the rest of the Torah like the Canterbury Tales are to us.
Interesting.
They sound
sure.
ancient, and I just think that's cool. A lot of the rest of the Torah gets written before the Babylonian exile, likely. Several different voices are writing it. And then after the Babylonian exile, in this time period that we're talking about in this episode, the Second Temple period, a lot more of the Bible gets written. And that's very clear because those books reference events, or they reference people who lived during this time period. So, it's clear that they couldn't have been written earlier than this. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what is true is that certainly by 70 CE, by the time that Rome sweeps through Judah and destroys Jerusalem, the Bible, it's at that point that the Tanakh is like more or less one thing that it stays. So It takes a while for it to kind of consolidate into something, for it to become clear what parts stay in and what parts don't stay in. The Bible itself references books that are now lost to us. But roughly by 70 CE, the Tanakh is what it is. And the books that are in it stay in it from then on. And so, of course, the Tanakh is the holy book of Judaism. And so that brings me to, Ellie summarizes a world religion. And so right now we're going to talk about Judaism. In Judaism, in the beginning, an eternal and indivisible God who exists outside of time and space creates the heavens and the earth. And that God is usually referred to as Yahweh. And so all of the heavens and the earth exist because of God, rather than independently of God. And then God makes humans in his own image. And creation is good. That's very common. Many religions view creation as a corruption from the purity of, the heavens or whatever. And the creation in Judaism is good. Judaism believes that people are fragile, like dust, but also divine because they're made from God. And so we're of the earth and of the divine. God reveals himself to the Jewish people through his actions and words. So they believe in revelation and that God is involved with his people. And so a big tenet of Judaism is an origin story. And this is the story of the covenant or the agreement that God makes with a man named Abraham. Abraham is from the Mesopotamian city of Ur, and Yahweh comes to him and he says, "Count the stars if you are able. As countless as the stars, so shall your descendants be." This is surprising news to Abraham, who has no children yet. And years go by and he still doesn't have children. And so eventually his wife sends her servant to Abraham, and they have a baby instead. And that baby's name is Ishmael. And then lo and behold, a few years later, his wife does have a baby, and his name is Isaac. So there's two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is older, and Isaac is younger, but the son of the wife. And so this, reverberates throughout history. So stay tuned.
Yeah, remember Ishmael and Isaac for sure. Yeah.
So, God has this covenant. He has this agreement. He says, if you follow the path of God, you can have a land, and I will show you how to get there. And so this promised land is interpreted very differently by different people throughout history. Sometimes it's literally like a piece of land, and then frequently it's metaphorically understood to mean a paradise. The men are circumcised as a physical sign of this covenant with God. And so, of course, it's a tall order to follow the path of God. How do we know what the path of God is? So in the Bible, there are 613 commandments, but 10 of them are the most important. In these 613 commandments, there's plenty of things like, what types of cloth your clothing should be made from, or what types of rocks you should carry in your pocket, but the 10 that are the most important are like, don't kill people, and, don't steal, and don't believe in other gods besides me. They're very, they're about like huge, important, very like concrete, basic things, not like your food or whatever. But in fact, there are 613, laws. And we as people sin, which literally means that we miss the mark and we don't necessarily do as God has told us to do. And then the last thing I want to say about Judaism is the Jewish people are waiting for a Messiah. And so Messiah means anointed one, and to be anointed, the kings of a place are anointed. So to be an anointed one means like one prepared to rule. Throughout the Tanakh, there are many prophecies about who the Messiah will be and what they will do. And so he will be a male descendant of David, who's a very important biblical patriarch, and the Messiah will rebuild the temple. And so this will be the third temple period at this point. And the Messiah will bring justice to all nations. And so there will be a time of peace. It will be called the Messianic Age. And, again, throughout the Tanakh, there are many prophets anticipating this time and the arrival of this Messiah. And as we've said when we've talked about many religions, and, already you said when we talked about Judaism, like none of this applies to what any given person thinks. And many, many people think that the arrival of the Messianic time is a metaphor. They're not waiting for a specific person, or maybe it will be several people, or maybe it will just be a time. So again, these things are like in broad terms, waiting for a Messiah, but is it an individual person? That's not, agreed upon. And that's Judaism in an inadequate nutshell.
Sounds good. One key term to talk about here before we move on is that of an Abrahamic religion. The three major Abrahamic religions are called Abrahamic in reference to the story Ellie just mentioned. Muslims, Jews, and Christians believe themselves to be the spiritual descendants of Abraham. Muslims through the line of Ishmael, and Christians and Jews through the line of Isaac. They believe themselves to be his predicted descendants, as numerous as the stars. So wrapping up the Israelites for now, what else is happening between 480 and 300 BCE?
So now we are going to go to north central Nigeria, and we're going to talk about the Nok culture.
Okay, sweet.
So the Nok culture is one of the early major complex civilizations in West Africa. We're in north central Nigeria, all the way into southern Niger and eastern Benin. And the height of the Nok culture is between 500 BCE and 200 CE.
200 CE, okay.
Yeah.
Jeez,
So it's long, yeah.
Okay,
yeah. And of course, like all these, the boundaries are arbitrary.
Yeah.
This is just when we say the height is, but probably they were stretching well beforehand.
Mm-hmm. But for sure, at least during the timeline of this episode, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you'll remember back in episode 1, when we talked about that metaphor of like how history is like a movie, and all we have is still photographs. The Nok culture is like the epitome of that metaphor, in that almost everything we know about them from one specific artifact that we find spread out. And so that is their terracotta.
Like the clay.
The clay, exactly. Huh. And so they make these very iconic statues, which I'll link you to on the website, and I imagine that you'll recognize. And they're the first widespread major statuary in Africa, south of the Sahara Desert, that we've found. So we'll circle back to the Nok terracotta statuary specifically in a minute. But first, I just want to talk quickly about what we can learn about the Nok people from other types of archaeology, like the little bits we have from other types of archaeology, their general package.
Okay.
So as we know, they're in the part of the world that has advanced iron smelting very early. So they're one of these groups that jumped from stone to iron with no Bronze Age between them. And so we have farming tools and weapons that are iron from the Nok people. So we have farming tools, they were agriculturalists.
Right.
And they grew cereals like pearl millet and amaranth. They grew African eggplant and okra and cowpeas. We have honey in some of their pots. And
nice.
Also sheep, goats, cattle. So, big time agriculturalists.
Yeah.
We have hardly any evidence of their actual buildings because they've just eroded over time. But we can tell that they lived in circular houses with thatched, domed roofs, and that those houses were clustered into compounds. Okay. And so maybe those were family groups. We don't know.
Okay. Not gigantic cities?
Yeah, as far as we can see, not gigantic cities, but we'll sort of get back to the idea of like centralized governments and when we talk about the statues in 1 second.
Okay.
We certainly do have evidence of robust trade and things like that. We have shells way, way inland, etc. Things far from their ecosystems. Archaeologically, we don't have much information about their government or their religious practices, except for guesses that we can make from their terracotta statuary themselves. We don't have writing, for example. We don't have like pages of documents about who owed taxes to who, And so let's talk about the terracotta artifacts and what we can learn from them. So they're not made on a wheel. They're not, pottery made on a wheel. They're made by molding and carving. The actual clay itself is made with very high concentrations of quartz and mica, which have a very high melting point.
Okay.
Yeah, so their kilns are incredibly hot and sophisticated. They're built into the ground with a fire at the bottom, and they burn at 1,000 degrees Celsius. They would reduce the oxygen inside them, which would make the clay red.
Whoa.
So when you think of that like iconic terracotta color, they were like cultivating it purposely, yeah. And so most iconic are these statues of people. There are also a lot of animals, snakes, birds, monkeys, etc. But the people, I feel like, are what you would recognize if you looked on our website at the pictures of them. And they have these long cylindrical heads, and they're frequently sitting in a posture with their knees up and their chin resting on their knees, looking out.
Right, I think I can picture that, yeah.
Yeah. And the Knox statuary had punctured eyes, nostrils, their mouth, their ears, which both I think was an artistic choice. Like it just looked realistic to have those be an actual puncture. But also it allowed all the water vapors and other gases that were building up inside the hollow chamber of the statue to exit it during the firing process without cracking the statue.
Sure. Wow.
What can we learn about the actual people, like the actual Knock people, from looking at these statues? And so there's a few things we can learn. One is just sort of basically about cultural norms. We can look at the clothing that these statues are wearing, and we can look at their intricate hairstyles or the jewelry that they're wearing, etc., and get like a glimpse at probably what were actually social practices, based on that. Many of these statues have different types of ornamentation, and some have elaborate body modifications or tattooing or scarification. And again, that, offers us a glimpse into
the reality of the day-to-day, yeah.
Yeah, social status practices, with the different types of, ornamentation, or maybe ritualized rites of passage with the tattooing and scarification. We can maybe learn a little bit about their social structures. Because interestingly, these statues are found across a space that is 78,000 square kilometers. Like, it's huge. And all of the clay seems to come from the same source.
Whoa, okay.
Yeah, wild.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's really
the same source?
Yeah, it's all from the same place. It's not like everybody just harvests clay from their own garden or something. It's not like that. It's all coming from one place. And so our best guess is that that's evidence for a centralized government, or at least a central marketplace of some sort. Just in general, the concept that there is consistency in a cultural practice like that over such a large space is potentially just, that's just evidence of a centralized government usually in the world. Otherwise, it's hard to explain why there would be so much consistency. Looking at the statues, we also have things like a statue of naked prisoners who are like tied with ropes around their necks and wrists. And that's, just likely evidence of slavery, which, is like, couldn't be more standard throughout the world, but just in terms of like the things that we can learn by looking at these statues,
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And then there's just the idea that the statues are so complex and so stylistically uniform, both at the same time. And there's so many of them, and they stay the same for hundreds of years. They don't evolve constantly. Right. And that is likely an argument for a specialized class of artisans. There's just a group of people whose job it is to make these statues, rather than just, we all like statues and every village has their own people with their own ideas about how to do it. Like that there's probably just a group of people and that this is their job.
Yeah, because otherwise you'd see massive variations over space, over time.
Exactly.
Material and technique, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so it just, gives us insight into some amount of class structure. And the last thing that we can possibly learn a tiny bit about is their belief systems. And that's in the way that we frequently find these statues purposely broken and buried.
How do we know they're broken on purpose?
I know. And the answer to that is that archaeologists can tell that kind of thing.
Okay, fair enough.
Not very satisfying, but I think you can see when a statue has been
honestly
broken.
Makes perfect sense. Yeah,
rather than, and then especially when you have so many of them.
Yeah.
Then it's just the evidence just builds up.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't tell us much about belief systems, but there's speculation about these representing the dead, or maybe it has to do with beliefs in what can be repaired and what can't be repaired, or, we don't really know, but it does seem as though there's a ritualized practice of breaking statues and burying them.
Interesting. You said ritualistically broken.
I know. There's so much ritual, so much just ritualistic.
Lots of
stuff.
ritual.
Yeah.
I feel like this is almost like a classic vibe at this point, where the less we know about a given culture or group, the more ritual we make out of it.
Well, I know. But then when you have tattoos and scarification, or the statues are broken the same way, it's we just don't have a different word than ritual.
Totally.
And
right.
So we don't know what we mean, but we mean happened regularly and was probably important,
For a reason. Yeah, right.
The Nok culture seems to have declined between about 200 and 500 CE. And all the usual culprits are potential suspects, like climate change or, human disruption to the ecosystem. And it's possible that deforestation, in order to make the charcoal to use to fire up these kilns.
The kilns. Whoa.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Might have been a variable. But we don't seem to have evidence that there was a major violent invasion of another group or something like that. We don't at least see that in an archaeological record. But either way, we just have another example of this complex, long-lasting, impactful culture that sort of disappears and we don't know why.
I'm starting to get pretty sick of that ending to these stories.
Yeah.
In this podcast, there's not usually time to talk about how historians know the things that they know, but there's an interesting phrase that comes up when talking about the Nok. It's attributed to the archaeologist George Murdoch. He says that for every ton of earth moved by archaeologists on the Nile, a teaspoon is moved on the Niger. In other words, Murdoch is saying that for a variety of reasons, way more archaeological research is done in Egypt than in Nigeria. Of course, without writing, we just will never have the granular day-to-day detail of the Nok that we have from ancient Egypt. Still, Ellie and I are regularly surprised by how extreme this gap is, by how much writing there is about certain groups, while it's difficult to find even one comprehensive book about many other groups that were living at the exact same time. So far in episode 7, we've covered the Israelites and the Nok culture in Nigeria. What else is going on between 480 and 300 BCE?
So we're going to go to what's now North America, and we're going to talk about the Woodland period, and specifically the Adena and Hopewell cultures.
Okay, cool.
The place that we're talking about is sort of on the eastern half of what's now the United States, all along the Ohio River. So if you are familiar with the geography of the United States, we're in West Virginia, Ohio, Kentucky, southern Indiana, east central U.S.
Okay, got it.
And so all through that entire region, and in fact, all through the entire eastern third of the United States, are tens of thousands of mounds, of earthen mounds, and then some stone mounds. And no people, no culture made more of these mounds than the Adena and Hopewell. The first thing I want to say about the Adena and Hopewell people is that we don't have writing from either one of them. So they very certainly weren't saying, I'm an Adena person or I'm a Hopewell person, because that was not what they called themselves. And unfortunately, we don't know what they did call themselves. I mean, this is true about so many of the peoples that we've talked about, including the Knock, 5 minutes ago. But I would say that the dates given for when the Woodland period is, or when the Adena period is, or when the Hopewell period is, varied so widely from source to source. Just given with authority, sometimes people would say, oh, the Adena, they began in 1000 BCE, and sometimes they would say 100 BCE.
Yeah, that seems notably different.
So different. And then where the boundaries are between the Hopewell and the Adena, it's so vague. And so the only thing I'll say is that the outlines for the Woodland period are between 1000 BCE and 1000 CE. So 3000 to 1000 years ago. And then within that Woodland period, the Adena culture comes first, and then it morphs into the Hopewell culture.
Okay,
but
got it.
Exact boundaries, I mean, man, they vary from source to source. So in terms of what we do know, without writing, but from archaeology and everything else, the Ohio River runs through a variety of ecosystems. So there's not a ton of flat ground, and instead there's all kinds of different ecosystems. So they're just widely adapted to many different ecosystems. And the river is this crucial sort of highway running through it all. And so, of course, physical goods are traded up and down and all along the Ohio River and its tributaries, but also it creates this intricate web of cultural exchange and idea exchange, etc. So throughout this whole time period and throughout this geographical region, there was many different ways in which people set their lives up. Many of them practiced seasonal living, which again means you live in sort of semi-permanent places for a while. But then maybe there's a different season in which, and it behooves you in that season to follow a herd or go to where the fish are running or go to where the nut trees are fruiting or whatever.
Similar to maybe the Jomon.
Yeah, it's very similar. Okay. To many groups. And so for the most part, they lived in homes made out of bent saplings that were covered with woven mats of plants or branches. There also sometimes, especially in the winter, sometimes people would live in caves, which in this mountainous region, that was a resource that, was widespread in this ecosystem. There don't seem to be something akin to palaces. There don't seem to be places where the wealthy people lived that's different from where other people lived. And we also don't see evidence, we have burials, we can see grave goods, and there don't seem to be elaborate graves of children with elaborate grave goods, which is a sign sort of the world over of hierarchy, sort of rigid hierarchy, because the child is already wealthy.
The child is, born into a different class. Yeah, you've mentioned that before,
Yeah. And so we'll circle back to burials in a minute, but we do have burials of people who appear to be important, and they have the same diet as everyone else, which again is kind of an important sign about how sort of social inequality is working within a people.
Sure.
In terms of diet, there was a lot of hunting, fishing, and gathering. They ate a lot of deer, turtle, bear, turkeys, rabbits, raccoons, etc. But also a lot of the earliest domesticates in North America were, during this woodland period, among the Adena. And so they grew barley and knotweed and sunflowers and squash. as well as did a lot of landscape manipulation to make wild indigenous foods that they wanted to grow. So,
Sure.
We've talked about that. That's like so common amongst all hunter-gatherers. They call it controlled production of indigenous foods. So, then you manipulate the landscape such that it grows blackberries and elderberries and walnuts, etc.
Mm-hmm. And that would be through things like maybe terracing or burning or...
all that. Exactly.
So they're doing both. They're cultivating and domesticating.
Yeah. Yeah, which again is quite common. As we've said so many times, the rigid distinction between hunter-gatherers and farmers is fake news.
Yeah.
And so the last thing I want to talk about is their iconic mounds, which are probably the most defining aspect of their archaeological package. Many of the mounds, especially of the Adena, are cone-shaped. And then over time, in a non-exactly linear way, but in an ebbing and flowing way, they become more intricate and more complex.
Okay.
And so most of the mounds, the mounds of the Hopewell and the Adena, have burials inside them. Sometimes they have a single person buried inside of them. Sometimes they have several people buried inside of them. And frequently the people are buried with elaborate grave goods. Mm-hmm. And, many of the mounds, especially in the early Adena, are very simple cone-shaped structures. But especially as we go through time, they become these elaborate structures that would have required massive amounts of cooperative labor. And so what does that tell us about their purpose? I mean, we don't know exactly, but the book that I was reading about them, which is by Susan Woodward and Jerry McDonald, said that it said that maybe like it provided a visible and permanent statement of a group's commitment to its own lineage, to any clan or other social entity of which it was part, and to its ancestral claim to the territory it considered to be its own. So like,
dude, I love that. Wait, will you read that quote again? I love that.
Yeah. Okay. So it said, the mounds provided a visible and permanent statement of a group's commitment to its own lineage, to any clan or other social entity of which it was part, and to its ancestral claim to the territory it considered to be its own.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
They were very clear that they weren't saying anything about like the idea of land ownership. It's not like I'm building a mound here, therefore it's mine, but more like the mounds that my people build here represent our connection to this land. It's like, this is the land we take care of. This is the land that takes care of us, and other people should know that. It's sort of a diplomatic marker, but also, like a honoring, it's half a boundary, half a church. So what's interesting about the grave goods is that, especially over time, especially as we get more into the Hopewell and out of the Adena, the grave goods are coming from far away. We have shells and other artifacts from ecosystems that are far, far away from these mounds. By the time we're at the end of the Hopewell culture, we have stuff from the Great Lakes and the Gulf of Mexico and Yellowstone. The Ohio River is a highway. So we have blades and arrowheads and pipes, copper jewelry, beads, engraved tablets, art of all sorts. But then, as I said, as we get into the Hopewell culture, which some sources would place between 500 and 200 BCE, which is exactly, the time period we're talking about in this episode, although some other sources call that the Adena. So just make of that what you will, please. But either way, roughly in here, some of these earthworks become very geometric shaped mounds. Like, it's not like Poverty Point exactly, but it reminded me of that in the sense that the mounds almost become a way of like drawing a bigger shape. They're long and outlining something, and they become enormous. There's a circle mound in which the circumference is 365 meters.
What?
Yeah. There's an octagon in Ohio, which encloses 50 acres. And the openings of the octagon, align with the rising and setting points of the moon. Of course. Yeah. And so,
of course.
Yeah, that's what's absolutely, I mean, what I just want to say is that these, the geometry of these mounds is wild. They like, people who really know about engineering are just like kind of blown away by how precise they are, over these huge spaces. And they're all aligned with the cycles of the sun and the moon in all kinds of crazy ways.
One more Hopewell earthwork that just boggles the mind is called the Great Hopewell Road. It's a set of 2 parallel mound walls that run straight for over 6 miles or 9 kilometers. Over hills and valleys, over streams and swamps, they continue straight. These 2 mounds seem to mark a wide road or avenue of some kind that's about 50 meters across. And as wild as 9 kilometers of straight line already is, there's growing evidence that these parallel walls are actually a straight connection between 2 distant groups of Hopewell mounds, which are 90 kilometers apart. Either way, 9 or 90 kilometers, the engineering involved in calculating the straight course of the Great Hopewell Road is truly remarkable.
Eventually, not in the time period of this episode, but like eventually it's also in this space, like around the Ohio River, that we eventually get like serpent-shaped mounds and stuff like that.
So about that stuff.
Yeah. So that's much later, but it seems like the heritage of that must be tied to this time, somehow.
The practice of building these mounds, surely evolves and changes, Yeah,
exactly. Especially because you got to figure like whoever is living in Ohio in 1000 CE when they're building Serpent's Mounds is living amongst the Adena and Hopewell's mounds.
Right.
I mean, they're there.
And they're ancient.
They're ancient. They're ancient. They're 1,000 years old at that point or more. Which is just, important to remember that it's like, these are ancient landscapes. Forget if they see Poverty Point, which is, 3,000 years old by the time.
Right. I was going to ask about that because I'm thinking like, that's not too far from the Ohio. Like surely there was some knowledge of Poverty Point and.
Yeah. The thing is like it is far, but not farther than they were all exchanging goods.
That's what I mean. Clearly, if you're getting to Yellowstone,
exactly.
Right.
And so then the last thing I want to say about the Hopewell culture is that we don't have some kind of dire end for them. Mm-hmm. As we said before, the Adena just sort of morph into what's eventually called the Hopewell. The Hopewell just sort of eventually morph into what we call the Fort Ancient culture. But there's no catastrophe like we've told so many times in other places. And again, these names are given by archaeologists retroactively. There's no rigid boundaries anywhere between these groups of people. And so these mound building cultures of the Adena and Hopewell slowly through incremental change turn into the Fort Ancient culture. And that is the culture of this area basically all the way until European contact.
So far, we've covered the Israelites, the Nok culture in Nigeria, and the Adena and Hopewell cultures in North America. Who is the last group to cover between 480 and 300 BCE?
So 480 to 336 BCE is the classical period of ancient Greece.
Okay, right.
And so we are going to go to Greece and talk about the classical period.
Okay, cool.
So the first thing I think we should do is catch up a bit on Greece. So if you'll remember back in episode 3, we talked about the Minoans living on Crete and how Crete sort of eventually gets taken over by the Mycenaeans. And then in episode 4, we talked about the Bronze Age collapse, which was that, disastrous series of events that swept across the entire Mediterranean world.
Right.
The Bronze Age collapse hits Greece hard. Maybe as much as a third of the population dies, or at least disappears. Maybe some of them moved during that time. So it's like this sort of catastrophe.
Okay.
Then, for the next several hundred years, until about 800 BCE, is what's known as the Greek Dark Age, which, just means that it was probably a good time to be alive and not a time that historians care about for whatever reason. During a dark age like that, what's frequently true throughout history is that the time before the catastrophe, the time before the thing like the Bronze Age collapse, becomes sort of mythologized. We have like a good old days dream about the time before the disaster, which makes perfect sense.
Yeah. It reminds me of when you were talking about Confucius and the spring and autumn period going to the Warring States period. We're looking back at the early spring and autumn period as like the good old days and the kings were great and all that.
Yeah, the kings were just, etc. Like I want to learn from them. Yeah, totally. And so in this case, during this Greek Dark Age, they're looking back at this time period of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and they're telling those stories, and they're telling them over and over again, around their fires for hundreds of years. And the stories sort of morph into these things that still have threads of history running through them and are also very mythologized. There's a lot of magic.
King Minos and Odysseus and that sort of thing. Okay.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And so that whole time period of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans becomes known as the Greek Heroic Age.
Sure.
Makes sense.
Of course.
Yeah.
Okay,
time of heroes, right? Like when we had huge palaces and minotaurs lived underneath them.
Yeah.
And the Bronze Age collapse, memories of that sort of coalesce into stories about the Trojan War, and the stories of the Trojan War couldn't be more familiar, and they couldn't be more foundational to Greece.
Right. This is Homer and the Iliad, Odyssey, right.
Yeah. And so if you're a king in Greece later on, you can explain how you're related to Achilles.
Sure. You better be able to.
You better be able to, exactly.
I see.
And so, of course, boundaries around ages are a little bit, hard to put any kind of pin in. But as we sort of exit this Greek Dark Age, city-states begin to coalesce and grow all throughout this Greek land.
Okay.
Eventually, they get an alphabet from the Phoenicians. They add vowels to it. And that alphabet is more or less the alphabet that, we are using to write our script for this podcast still to this day.
Sure.
In variation. And then, we get this kind of blossoming in writing because of that alphabet. Again, alphabets make a much broader section of the population literate suddenly. So, we get things like the Iliad and the Odyssey get written in the 700s. We start to get, huge blossomings in math and philosophy and music, etc. The Greeks begin to sail all around the Mediterranean and the other, small seas that are in the area. And they basically are colonizing right around the beaches, right around the rim of these bodies of water. Plato describes the Greeks as living like ants or frogs around a pond.
Sure.
Yeah. So they're in, Bulgaria, Romania, Moldova, Ukraine, Turkey, Greece, Italy, Albania, Libya. They have colonies eventually by the 500s from Spain, to Ukraine. It's a big, big thing, but just again, right around the edges. So what's interesting about that is we've said that, the Greeks have done this. So one question is who are the Greeks? And that is a classic example of it depending on the eye of the beholder very dramatically. And so these are city-states, and all they do is war with each other. Just all they do is try to take each other out. And so in so many ways, all that really makes them all the same is that they all speak Greek. They all worship the same gods. They sort of have a cultural package in common. But in terms of do they have a national state identity? No. And not only that, but they're each other's biggest adversaries.
Mortal enemies.
Yeah, right. Frequently. And so again, they also sometimes come together and, Sparta and Athens fight off the Persians like we talked about in episode 6. But the rest of the time, all Sparta and Athens do is try to kill each other,
Got it. It's a bit reminding me a bit of when you were talking about Mesopotamia and the city-states of Sumer and Akkad and things like that. We call them all Mesopotamia, but all they do is fight with each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so there are a few things that give the Greeks sort of a cultural identity. And those are things like the Olympics.
Okay.
And so the Olympics are like an opportunity for them all to like fight with each other without actually killing each other, to just compete with each other.
Mm-hmm.
And they, again, speak the same language, worship the same gods. And then they have interesting things in their kind of cultural package in common. Like many of these city-states are democracies. And so, we've had like 800 conversations about like anytime you see the word first, like be suspicious, anytime somebody says this is the first. But since this is the first time they called it democracy, which is still what we call it, Greece certainly gets the credit. And so were they really the first big group to ever like give the people a right to help make the decisions? I have no idea. But in the sense of how it was organized, Athens gets sort of credit. So
totally. Also, like, obviously modern criticism is like, it wasn't a democracy in any way, shape, or form.
I mean, but like, what is?
But it was more, what is fair, and it was more than other things.
So exactly. What it meant was that the free men could help make decisions, which is still way more people than can help make the decisions in almost any other place. So, gold star for them, but nevertheless, but it just is important to remember that when we're talking about democracy, slavery is also a huge part of the Greek economy. Mm-hmm. And that's common, that's sort of standard the world over. Unfortunately, it's not unusual about the Greeks at all, but it just is important to remember when we're talking about the origins of democracy that, slavery couldn't be a bigger part of this economy.
Okay.
And so as we talked about in episode 6, Persia invades and is sort of epically and surprisingly fought off in 480-ish BCE. Mm-hmm. And this kind of begins this time that's called the Classical Age. And this time is still mostly marked by all these city-states warring with each other, and Athens and Sparta especially warring with each other, and both sort of making the argument, we need to unite against the big bad Persians, so everybody should unite under me, and I'll tell you all what to do and keep you safe, Pay a lot of tribute to me, and then our army will be big, that kind of thing. Right. And so at various points in these wars, various Greek city-states like side with Persia. They are like, Persia, come help us take out this other group. So Greek identity is very much based on like Persia as the bad guy. But in fact, at any given moment, they're totally working with Persia, which again is like a pretty normal story, like wherever you are. Yeah.
This is a moment of contrast because unlike Poverty Point or the Bantu expansion or the Assyrians, most people, myself included, have a lot of knowledge about the Greeks bouncing around in their heads. I thought it might be helpful to place some of those things into their World History 24 context and talk about that influence for a minute. It's during the years, roughly spanning episode 6 and this episode 7, that the Parthenon is built in Athens, the militarism of Sparta is at its height, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates are philosophizing. Euripides, Sophocles, Aristophanes, and Aeschylus are writing literature, not to mention Homer and Sappho just a few hundred years earlier. Cleisthenes lays out the principles of democracy. Herodotus, aka the father of history, writes his unreliable account of the Greco-Persian Wars. Pythagoras and Euclid map out geometry, and Archimedes shouts Eureka. As the list goes on, you can't deny the Greeks did some cool stuff. But this doesn't fully explain their outsized influence over the world today, especially the English-speaking world. After all, lots of these civilizations did cool stuff. But think about it. You can run a marathon, have an Oedipus complex, take the Hippocratic Oath, build your home with Doric columns or Spartan simplicity. You can look up at the night sky and see Cassiopeia or Orion, or look inside your body and find an Achilles tendon and a hippocampus. Or walk downtown and government buildings and prestigious universities look Greek. It would be a Heraclean effort to name all the Percy Jacksons, Hades towns, Songs of Achilles, and 300s that dominate movie theaters, stages, and bestsellers lists. It's not simple, but this linguistic and academic influence comes to you via a long chain of empires that we'll talk about, each preserving and revitalizing the Greek legacy in different ways. America, the British, the Caliphates, the Romans, the Seleucid, and the Ptolemaic empires. But this chain certainly begins with a conquest story, the one Ellie's about to tell, the story of Alexander the Great.
So we said a few minutes back that this period, this Greek classical age, ended in 323 BCE. Mm-hmm. So what happened in 323 BCE that sort of brought this age to a close? And the answer to that is the death of Alexander the Great and the cracking of the massive empire that he created.
Okay.
So at the time of Alexander the Great's death, Greece, such as it exists, the Greek Empire is as giant and as influential as it ever is. So that's the story that we're going to tell right now.
Got it.
The story of Alexander the Great very, very much highlights the question of who is a Greek? And it very much highlights the question of, do the people who are alive at the time get to decide who a Greek is, or do sort of we looking back get to decide who a Greek is? So,
Sure.
Keep that in mind as we talk, and it will make sense. So there is a kingdom called Macedon, and that kingdom is in the land that's now occupied by the modern countries of northern Greece, and a little bit of the Republic of North Macedonia, and a little bit of Bulgaria.
Okay.
So this kingdom of Macedon is ruled by a man named Philip II from the years of 359 to 336 BCE.
Okay.
So this king, Philip II, takes over an enormous empire, including most of what, is sort of more traditionally considered Greece at the time. And the Greek city-states do not take this threat seriously until it's way too late. And part of that is because they're sort of dismissing him as like this upstart king from like nowhere important. And so Philip II very much views himself as Greece. Macedon, it competes in the Olympics, for example.
Sure,
and again, the fact that he wants to conquer them in no way makes him not Greek. All the Greek city-states do is conquer each other. You know what I mean? So that's just standard. But it's just worth knowing that like Sparta, Athens, Thebes, these city-states that are very like traditionally like Greece, do not consider him Greek. In fact, Demosthenes, who's this brilliant orator from Athens, he's a very famous Athenian. This is his quote. He has nothing to do with the Hellenes, which is like the word for Greeks. He's not even a barbarian from a place that one could speak well of, but a pestilence of a Macedonian, from a place that used not to be able to provide even a slave worth buying.
Nice. I feel like that quote highlights both the fact that Greece was obsessed with slavery and how Greece is such a nebulous historical idea.
Certainly. There's snobs.
Yeah, exactly.
So regardless of whether or not they view him as a pestilence of a Macedonian, he takes over Greece, Albania, Bulgaria, the Republic of North Macedonia, and a huge amount of Turkey.
Okay.
And then he's murdered, and he leaves this empire to his son, who is, you guessed it, Alexander the Great.
Alex.
So this young person, Alexander, grew up being tutored by Aristotle and largely being left to defend the home front while his father was out conquering an empire. And so then, he gets a little older and his dad dies, and his dad is murdered very publicly. And who murdered him? Who knows? It doesn't seem out of the question that it was like Alexander's mom or him or whatever. But either way, Alexander's like, how dare someone murder my father? I bet it was you or you or you or you who happened to be all his competitors, and he has them all executed. And then suddenly Alexander is like the ruler of this massive, massive empire.
Totally.
And so, of course, one of the things that makes Macedonia not Greek in the Greeks' eyes is that they have inherited kingship at all. You know, Alexander just gets this kingdom. It's not like there's going to be an election or something. And the Greeks very much disapprove of this. But nevertheless, he's unfazed by that and is like, I'm going to go take over the whole world, especially Persia. Because they took us over, or they tried to take us over 150 years ago, but I'm mad about it still. We're going to go get them. So he just starts like this huge campaign. And I mean, this is like one of the most famous like conquering journeys ever in, you know, like world history. And everybody from like Napoleon on is like obsessed with Alexander the Great, views him as an example. He very famously never lost a battle. I have no idea if that's true, but
probably not.
Yeah, probably not. But in terms of World History 24, all we need to know is that Alexander spends his life on a series of campaigns conquering what he views as the known world. Creating this massive Greek empire and spreading the Greek language all through it, you know, spreading these ideas that have arisen during this classical age, all this sort of Greek culture through his massive new empire. And so we've said so many times in this podcast, like the history of the intersection of Afro-Eurasia is just a story of one empire swallowing the previous empire and expanding it, you know, like all the way back to episode 2 with like Sumer, and then the Akkadian Empire is bigger than it, you know, and then it's like
the Assyrians,
Egypt, Assyrians, Babylon, Persia, blah, 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 you know, and like each one, you know, overlays the last one and makes it bigger, you know. And so Alexander the Great's empire is the latest in this, and his empire stretches all the way to India. You know, he sort of famously fights battles like against elephants, and it's all very like epic and bloody and whatever. You know, and so he spreads all through that whole massive region, renaming every other city Alexandria, you know, which several of them still are to this day, Alexandria, you know. And he's mostly viewed as a conqueror, although also sometimes he's viewed as a liberator, because of course many of those people are already being subjugated by someone else, so they're kind of like happy to throw off the Persians and instead be ruled by the Greeks for a minute or whatever. And then, having conquered that entire thing, he dies almost immediately, like within the year.
Whoa! So he conquers all that space and then he dies.
Yeah. Whoa! He dies saying, "Whoever's the strongest, you know, can have the kingdom," which. You know, like obviously, go so well. It's like, of course, like a disaster to say that to, you know, like all your second in commands, you know. So instead of this cohesion, the empire immediately fractures, just instantly.
Interesting. So that whole space that he like unified is now split again into smaller empires.
Exactly. Okay. And this begins this whole time, which is called the Hellenistic period, meaning the Greek-ish period. You know, many of these empires are now ruled by generals of Alexander the Great. You know, they're very Greek. And so Greek thought, you know, Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek math, etc., is sort of interacting with Jewish intellectuals in the Levant, you know, with the Persians, with the Egyptians, with Buddhist and Vedic intellectuals in India, you know, etc. It's this very rich period of cultural exchange and idea generation.
This Hellenistic period.
I see. Exactly. Okay. Exactly. And so Alexander the Great's conquest of mainland Greece and his subsequent death does, in fact, end the Greek classical age, like in actual Greece. And, sort of ironically, they're like partying in the streets because this foreign invader has died, who obviously has nothing to do with them.
Right, the pestilence of a Macedonian
Exactly. Okay. And I say ironic because, of course, like, in fact, in so many ways, the reason that all those ideas and all that art and et cetera that was generated during the classical age exists and remains so important is like because he spread it all the way through this gigantic Hellenistic world.
I see. Okay.
And so there's also one other important reason that the accomplishments of the classical age of Greece are so widely remembered. And that is because sort of throughout this whole episode in the background, Rome is growing.
Right.
And Rome eventually becomes sort of obsessed with the Greeks, with Greek identity, with Greek culture. They view them as the height of sophistication. They want to tie their own origin story to Greece to sort of give themselves like sophistication and, intellectual and cultural clout. And so we'll talk about that in the next episode, but just know that sort of as Greece is falling, Rome is in the background, and Rome really sort of preserves a lot of like what we think of, as kind of our collective memory of Greece.
Interesting. Okay. Well, that seems like a pretty good place to leave the episode. I suppose we'll pick up right there in episode 8.
Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
And with that, we come to the end of our 7th call, which we covered the years from 480 to 300 BCE. We covered the Israelites, the Knock, the Adena and Hopewell, and the beginning and end of the classical period of ancient Greece. In our next episode, we'll cover the years from 300 to 100 BCE. From India, Ashoka the Great spreads a local religion across Asia, making Buddhism a world religion. The shortest Chinese dynasty, the Qin, unites the warring states and starts connecting the northern fortifications into a wall you may have heard of. Meanwhile, a small kingdom in the Italian hills starts to expand and win a lot of wars. We'll end the episode with another famous campaign as Hannibal sets out from Carthage, bringing his army and war elephants across Spain and over the Alps on an epic quest to destroy Rome. Bye, Ellie.
Bye, Charlie.
World History 24 is written and researched by Ellie Casella. I do the production and music. Our logo and design work is done by Alyssa Alarcón-Santo. For links to any sources mentioned in the episode, as well as lots of fascinating extra material, visit worldhistory24.com. You can also find information there about how to support this podcast. That's worldhistory24.com. My name is Charlie Casella, and on behalf of myself and my sister, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next hour.